Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. Our topic for the next series of lectures, Ancient Greece. And you learned during our last lecture about the ancient Greeks during the Bronze Age. We discussed, Dr. Price discussed the Minoans that lived on the island of Crete. He also discussed the Mycenaeans that lived on the Greek mainland. So it is at the point where the Mycenaean Greeks will disappear, their civilization will fall, that we see this period of the Greek Dark Ages instituted around 1200, 1100 BC. And when I mean a Dark Age, remember the Mycenaeans had a form of script or writing called Linear B that we eventually were able to decipher in the 1950s by a guy named Michael Ventris. He is responsible for deciphering Linear B. But that disappears with the fall of Mycenaean civilization. And so writing disappears, and it will not come back until around 1750 BC. So this Greek Dark Age that Dr. Price will lecture on, his lecture is titled From Oikos to Polis, which basically means, you can translate oikos to mean like a household, because we're not seeing a lot of formality. In fact, I mean, there's not any written records that we can refer to when trying to find out what's happening during this Greek Dark Age. There's a lot of oral traditions, of course, that were passed down from generation to generation that we can determine something of the society. But translated, oikos means household, basically. But, you know, definitely a primitive kind of environment for these Greeks during the Dark Ages. It's interesting, Dr. Price will talk about some of the things that we do know about the Greek Dark Ages, about their warrior society, and something about their religion that we can determine. It seems like they were animist and ancestor worshipers. We'll find out a little bit more about what that means. And of course, interesting, Dr. Price will talk about this as well, but women were stolen or kidnapped. And it's interesting to find out that that wasn't altogether uncommon in other primitive societies as well. So we'll find out more about how females were, how they were positioned in society during this Greek Dark Age period. Also, Dr. Price will discuss family units and how there was a cult of the hero that was formed, that formed the center of the communities. It kind of united these families together. We're not seeing formal cities as yet. That will come later, of course. Now, this period begins the Iron Age, I guess you could say, the Iron Age Greeks. So we've gone out of the Bronze Age with this. And Dr. Price also will give us more definition about polis, the word polis, and what that means, because we will refer to these city-states, and it actually means city-state, or these polises throughout a lot of our lectures here dealing with ancient Greece. You know, you can say a community, a city, or a city-state. Some of the famous city-states in Greek history would be Athens, of course, that we'll have a lecture on by itself, and then Sparta. You may have heard of Sparta. They like Hollywood does quite a lot of movies about Sparta as well. That will have its own lecture coming up as well. Those were two of the very prominent city-states in Greek history. But Dr. Price will tell us exactly what a polis is. We'll learn more about the city-state itself, what it included. There was an acropolis, which was the high ground, I guess you could say, the fortress of the city. There was an agora. An agora was like a market that people could come and buy, and farmers could sell their goods. The agora was also a very important part of the polis, or the city-state, here in Greek history. And of course, Dr. Price will talk about that the polis develops political power, shifted from those families, those tribal leaders, I guess you could say, from the Dark Ages, and it starts shifting toward a king, a hereditary king, which means it's by birth, who had both political and religious duties, called a basileus. Basileus. You'll hear that term again when Dr. Price begins his lecture. Let's see. He also will discuss the problems of Greek kingship, and of course the social structure, the political structure of these city-states, or different polises there. All right. And of course, how tyrants will start to come into power in Greece as well. So basically, this is a development from the ancient civilizations in Greek history, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and we go through a Dark Age period that will be discussed in this lecture, and then we'll get on into the development of the polises and the actual, how their governments developed. And we'll see that this was very important to Western civilization, especially as far as democracy is concerned, and the city-state of Athens. But Sparta will also, the other city-state of Sparta will also be very important to civilization. In fact, a lot of future, some important people, some nefarious figures in our history will admire Sparta. Plato, the Greek philosopher, admired Sparta. Men like Hitler over Germany, World War II, admired Sparta. And there were others, of course. So Sparta has its place in history as well. Of course, when we think of Greece, we think Athens and we think democracy. But let's find out about that Greek Dark Age from oikos to polis and see how the stage is set for the very famous part of Greek history.
As we saw last time, between 1200 and 1100 BC, the Bronze Age Greek civilization that we call the Mycenaeans collapsed and literally disappeared. After the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, there is a decline in any kind of real civilization in Greece down to the end of the 9th century. So for a period of about 300 years, Greece undergoes what historians call the Greek Dark Age, or the Dark Age of Greece. Because for the most part, for the first half of the 20th century, we really didn't know much about what was going on in Greece for that period between the Bronze Age and the Classical period, or at least the period we call the Archaic. Some of the technology of the Mycenaeans was preserved in the Iron Age, but not much. And some of the religious ideas were preserved apparently straight through the period. The Iron Age Greeks, because this period brings in a new period called the Iron Age, the Iron Age Greeks remembered enough about the Mycenaeans to know that a high level of civilization was possible, but they didn't remember enough, nor did they have the wealth or the technology simply to copy the Mycenaeans. That Bronze Age Mycenaean age was gone and would never return. They couldn't copy the Near East either, because these Greeks during the Dark Age simply had no contact with other parts of the Mediterranean, and so with the fall of Bronze Age civilization in Greece, we see a return, if you will, to a more primitive time. We don't have any written records from the period because the early Iron Age Greeks didn't have a writing system. They had lost Linear B, and it would be nearly 350 years before they came up with a new system of writing that they acquired from the Phoenicians, and this new system would be the phonetic Greek alphabet, at least an early version of what we know as the Greek alphabet today. The well-organized Mycenaean government that we talked about a while back crumbles, falls apart, no longer exists, and the peoples of the Aegean reverted to very primitive family-style organization for the most part. Now, in the Mycenaean period, there had been a dominant and very clearly defined ruling class. The Wanaks, the king, and his administrators, his bureaucrats, took care of the business of these Mycenaean states. All of that simply disappears at the beginning of the Iron Age, or it disappears around 1200 with the fall of Mycenaean civilization. What replaces it, the basic unit of government in the Dark Age, is essentially the family, the household. And the Greek word for household that we're going to use from time to time in here is oikos. So what we see is a crumbling from Bronze Age civilization to the civilization of the oikos, the family unit and the household. Members of the oikos included usually one central family and their retainers. In many cases, these are landless warriors and what few slaves they may have. And that's essentially about it. Some small farmers, some tenders of livestock, but all of these folks are connected to a landed family. And the landed family is the head of this very centralized, very small unit. The oikos essentially is a relatively simple system of government. The family acted to protect its members from outsiders, and male family members and extended members, the retainers and warriors and so forth, combined both to defend their own livestock and their own home and to, when possible, attack neighbors and take what they could from them. To steal livestock and women became an important part of the life of the oikos. Decisions affecting the whole oikos were made by a council of elders under the guidance and influence of the family head. Greece in the Dark Ages is essentially a frontier society. Folks take it upon themselves to protect what's theirs, and occasionally, when possible, to take what they can from neighboring oikoi, plural, from neighboring families. Interfamilial activities most often involved blood feud because there are virtually no differences of wealth within the family itself. There existed a fairly strong assumption in the Greek Dark Age oikos that all males old enough to bear arms are equal. Religion in the Dark Ages is kind of complicated. And to tell you the truth, we're not entirely sure that everything we have to say, all of our theories are correct, but I'll try to give you a little bit of a sense of Dark Age religion. These early Greeks are animists, and they're also ancestor worshipers. I should mention at this point that a lot of the evidence we have actually comes from the Iliad and Odyssey, actually comes down to us from what we can glean from Homer, who is talking about this period of time, even though he seems to be referring to the Mycenaean age. He's actually talking about the Dark Age, which would be the couple of 3 generations that preceded him. So, Greeks are essentially animists. They have belief in some important gods, and then they believe that there are spirits that inhabit all of the various phenomena of nature. They also venerated the dead. They also have a sort of a primitive ancestor worship. At death, the body and soul of the deceased was thought to be filled with dangerous and powerful manna, dangerous and powerful magic, if you will. And a great deal of care had to be taken of the body. A series of steps had to be employed to cleanse the body and prepare it for burial. Now, bodies were buried in family plots. The oikos had to be around, or the body had to be near the family, the oikos, so that libations and sacrifices could be given to the dead from time to time in order to ensure that the dead would essentially stay put, that the dead wouldn't come back and haunt the living. The Greeks believed, apparently the Dark Age Greeks believed, that the spirits of the dead, if they came back, would be unhelpful, would be maleficent, would be cruel to the living, and the only time the dead would come back would be if the living had not met their obligations to sacrifice to the dead. Now it becomes very important because in essence it becomes absolutely necessary for the living to have access to the tombs, the graves of the dead in order to perform these sacrifices. So since the dead are buried on family land, the notion of family land, the notion of home as a place where you, as essentially a specific geographical location where the family needs to stay. This notion of home as a specific geographical place becomes very important to the Greeks. And later it will be expanded to the notion of community. Now, this was a warrior society. The best families, the most powerful families, were those who were most able to defend their own lands and, when possible, steal a little something from their neighbors, mostly livestock and women. Well, the idea that in the Greek Dark Ages these folks stole women should be mentioned probably in a little bit more detail. Anthropologists tell us that in primitive societies in which blood feud is an important, if you will, cultural artifact, primitive societies that engage in tribal or familial blood feud, woman stealing is a very important aspect of that society, a very important aspect of that life. Every family, of course, needs women in order to propagate the family, and incest, that is marriage too close within your family, is sort of universally looked at with disgust. Well, if every family needs women to propagate, and incest is right out, and almost every interaction with your neighbors is a violent interaction, the question is, how do you get women? If I'm the father of the household and little Billy is old enough now to get married and make some more household members, he needs a wife. And his sister and his first cousin are right out, so I can't just send little Billy over to the neighbors to date Wanda, because if little Billy, by the time he gets there, they're probably going to kill him. After all, there's blood feud between the two families. So what we do is we raid the neighbors, we steal some of their cattle, and we steal Wanda and bring her back, and Billy and Wanda get married. Wanda becomes part of my family, and so the needs of the family are fulfilled through the process of wife stealing. This system, over time, has a very important effect on late Dark Age Greek community building. Now, for generations, wives have come from neighboring families, which essentially means that all the families in a particular area have become over time cousins. There is a bond of kinship through these wife raids that we think by the later Dark Ages people begin to realize. It's possible now for several oikoi, several family units, to sort of coalesce into a bigger tribal or clan unit. Now, as a result of this realization of relatedness, several families can form into a tribal unit that's called a genos, G-E-N-O-S. These genoi are ruled by a chief who leads them in warfare, and a council of older warriors who are called the boule or boule. The word essentially means council. This is a very primitive form of government, yet we can see that this is the roots of almost all Greek government thereafter. An executive of some sort, a council that advises, and an assembly of warriors who vote yes or no, vote up or down on the advice of the council. A factor that further unites these various families was the growth and promotion of the idea that the genoi, the various, the tribe itself, were united by a common important ancestor known as a hero. Now, there were lots of mythological heroes in Greece during this period of time, quite a few of them. One of the most popular is Heracles. The Romans call him Hercules, but a lot of the heroes of the Iliad and Odyssey are also heroes that come from this idea. And what happens is a genos, one of these clans, come to the realization that all of them are related. And the relationship that they decide that they have is a patrilineal relationship that's connected to one particular hero. Now, you have to admit it's better to say, well, we're all cousins because Heracles came in here and got everybody pregnant, than it is to say, well, we're all cousins because we've spent the last 300 years grabbing each other's women. So the hero cult grows up in Greece. It becomes sort of a central glue that glues these various families together. We know that by about 800 or maybe a little earlier, these various genoses, these various tribes, had begun to find a sort of a central spot to place an altar to the hero, and they would have annual festivals in celebration of the hero. And then over time, they began to build altars and even primitive temples to the various gods that were associated with the families and the heroes. So Greek religion sort of moves right along with the growth of Greek communities and is tied to some extent to this hero cult. Over time, small villages begin to develop around the hero cult centers. These villages become centers of local government. They become the centers where they become the center where the assembly meets to decide important issues for the genos. They become the place where the markets take place, where different people who have different wares to trade for food and whatnot begin to come on a given day to barter for goods. These originally religious centers rapidly become communities, rapidly become town centers that serve all the folks in the valley. And each family, at about this time, sort of the mid-800s, Greek agricultural production begins to improve. The Greeks begin to grow more and more food. With more and more food comes an expansion of the population. And Greeks begin to trade once more. They begin to build ships. The Greeks are good shipbuilders and good sailors. They begin to build ships and travel all over the Eastern Mediterranean. They begin to make contact with the various other civilizations in the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean. Probably the first Greek community to benefit from this new growth of trade and population was Athens. Now, we didn't know this until a few years ago, about a decade ago, when the Athenians, the people in Athens, were about to host the Olympic Games. When they began to excavate for the subways, they began to find out run into all kinds of interesting earlier artifacts. And what we begin to realize is that civilization never really completely vanishes in Athens. That Athens continued to be a fairly strong civilization all the way through the catastrophe of 1200. Not as strong as it had been as a Mycenaean state, but it continues to be a fairly strong, fairly advanced civilization all the way from 1200 down, well, for the rest of its existence. And so Athens is probably the first place to be able to take advantage of this renewal of trade, these food surpluses, and the growth of population. By about the 800s, increased agricultural production and population increase put enormous pressure on the available resources in Greece. If you look at a map of Greece, you see that there's very limited agricultural land. There is very limited mainland production facilities, resources, and as the population begins to grow, Greece can simply no longer, the limited resources in Greece can simply no longer support this population growth. So by the late 800s BC, the Greeks begin to colonize. They begin to branch out, to leave Greece proper and build colonies literally all over the Mediterranean and even in the region of the Black Sea. The Greeks begin, especially the Athenians, to send their surplus population away from Greece and start new colonies elsewhere. Colonies in Asia Minor, colonies on the shores of the Black Sea, colonies in southern Italy and Sicily, colonies in North Africa, even colonies in what today would be France and Spain. This excess population essentially creates a Greek world in the Mediterranean as more and more Greeks leave the mainland and leave the Aegean Islands to settle and form colonies elsewhere. Eventually, communities begin to absorb most of the functions of the family, most of the functions, the political functions at any rate, of the oikos, becoming a sort of a super family, a community at large that essentially is beginning to have politics and government. Now, these early Greek communities still carry a strong assumption that any male who bears arms for the community, in other words, any male warrior who fights for the community, should have some say in government, should have, are essentially equal and should have some say in government. And of course, this is the basis of the Greek community of the classical period that grows up right at the end of the 800s BC. And this community is called the polis, P-O-L-I-S, the polis. Polis is kind of a difficult word for us. Polis could be defined as city or city-state or community in English. Polis can be a bit confusing, the way that we often use it. For Greeks, the word meant the actual sort of headquarter town for a larger geographical state, sort of like we might use the word capital. The polis is, most of the people in the Greek state live in the countryside, at least in this early period, and then they coalesce, they come together as citizens in the headquarters town in order to take up important political or important religious matters. Every polis is the center for a particular community of people. And that's the way that the Greeks would refer to it. If I ask you where you come from, you might say, I'm from New Orleans, or I'm from Baton Rouge, or I'm from Denham Springs. If I ask an Athenian where he comes from, he might say, I am from the polis of the Athenians, or merely I am from among the Athenians. So the stress isn't put on a geographical place, it's put on a particular group of people who identify themselves with a particular place. The polis then is a sort of a community headquarters. It's where the people of a state, the people of a territorial area come together in order to take part in the political activities that a citizen takes part in order to take part in the religious activities that a citizen should take part in. And over time, the polis also becomes a market center. So people come to the polis in order to take part in the economic activities of the wider community. The polis is usually dominated by a large, well-fortified hill, and this area is supposed to be a refuge in times of war. It's somewhere where the people can come to because it's fortified and they can defend themselves. Probably for that reason, there is a temple to the patron god or goddess on the top of the hill. And this hill is called, this area at the top of the hill is called the Acropolis. Acropolis. Acro means high, polis means town or headquarters. So essentially what Acropolis means is the high town. Now, another major feature of any polis is a large flat field. And on this field, originally the area is used for town meetings and to muster the militia, the warriors. But as the towns begin to prosper, it also becomes the marketplace for the city. And this area is called the agora, which means essentially the open place. Agora. It has become in modern Greek the term for a market. If I'm going to the agora, it means I'm going shopping. Now, as the polis developed, political power shifted from family and tribal chieftains to a single hereditary king. Now, the king probably came from the most important or the most powerful oikos. The word for king is basileus. So the basileus is the king of a Greek state, Greek polis. But I should point out that the king in this case is nowhere near as strong as those folks who are called kings or pharaohs in the Near East. There are a number of reasons why the office of king, the office of monarch in Greece, really never develops into the kind of sort of absolute god king that you see in Egypt, or the absolute agent of the gods that you see in the Near East. So let's talk about three of those reasons why this position never really becomes that powerful. The first one is there is no precedent for a strong central ruler in Greece. In Egypt, there's a 3,000-year precedent for Pharaoh. The mythology is already in place that describes him as the god king. In the Near East, there's a long precedent of kings as agents to the gods. Well, there simply isn't that kind of tradition in Greece. In fact, even though families and villages had had a war leader, the day-to-day business of the family and the day-to-day politics of the family was actually done by the council, the boule, as it's called. So the first of these reasons why kings don't become strong is because there simply isn't a tradition for a strong central ruler in Greece. The second reason is, even though the basileus is king, he is still a member of the polis, a citizen, if you will, and therefore, despite his duties and despite his military and political position, he's really not any more important than anybody else in the polis, than any other citizen. He is still identified, even though he's the king, he's still identified as yet another citizen of the polis. A very, very strong assumption of equality. And I've mentioned that a few times before, and it's pretty important when we think about how the Greeks behave and how their civilization evolves and develops. So that's the second thing. He's really no more important, despite his functions, than any other citizen. Now, there is a third problem in this very early period, in the 800s BC. The king is, in many ways, simply regarded as the best, strongest warrior. Leadership skills are linked to battle skills. So a younger, bigger, stronger, more able warrior might come along and challenge the basileus, challenge the king, and ultimately defeat him and replace him. It's sort of an Old West notion where a faster, younger gunslinger might come along and knock off the aging gunslinger. So since it's based on skills and it's based on warrior abilities, the king can always be sort of defeated. Now, the problems of Greek kingship prompted communities in Greece fairly early, again by the late 800s, to come up with a dandy solution. The citizens began to elect one or more annual officials. That is, they began to elect one or more people who would serve as an official of the state for 1 year, annual officials, to take over some or even all of the functions of the king. Magistrates, as they're called, didn't receive any pay for the job, which is rather time-consuming. So only a wealthy individual who could afford to leave his farm and family for a year and move to the polis, move to the headquarters of the state to take up these unpaid jobs, official jobs. Only a very wealthy individual could do this. In most city-states, by the mid-700s BC, say 750 or so BC, these elected officials, these magistrates, came to replace the king altogether. The king might still exist in some areas for religious purposes, because whatever religious activities he was supposed to take care of, rituals or sacrifices, the folks in the city-states might say, well, you know, we got to have the king. What happens if we elect an official and the gods aren't down with the change from the king to the elected official? So in some city-states, kings continue, but only sort of in a very limited religious context. And the real politics of the states, the real policy matters of the polis are taken over by these annually elected officials. Now, at about when the king is replaced with a magistrate, the council becomes a really important organ of government, because the council deliberates on policy. The council of elders, the boule, becomes an incredibly important part of government. It no longer exists just to advise the king. Heck, there isn't one. It now deliberates and discusses and debates policies and then takes those policies to the assembly to vote on. So the council becomes very influential, very important, very powerful. At about the same time, the citizens, that is, all the males who bear arms in defense of the community, the citizens, begin to meet in an assembly, a great assembly of citizens, in order to vote on the proposals of the council. Now, in this early period, these assemblies are not deliberative. That is, they're not allowed to discuss or debate policy. That's for the council. They are only allowed to vote yes or no to any policy sent to them by the council. So, by at least the end of the 800s, maybe the early 700s, you begin to see a pattern emerge in Greek city-states all over Greece, and actually all over the Mediterranean, because there are city-states, Greek city-states in areas that aren't in Greece. You begin to see a pattern emerge where you have a sort of a generic government made up of an executive, could be a king, could be by now mostly elected magistrates, the council that discusses policy, and the assembly that votes on that policy. And this will become a standard, at least some permutation of this will become the standard kind of government in the Greek world. By 750 to 600 BC, there is a very strong presupposition of equality in Greek communities. So it might be surprising for us to find out today that during this period, a new kind of government emerges, and it is because some families emerge as more important, more wealthy, more powerful than other families. And these families are called the aristoi, what we might call the aristocrats. You begin to see the growth all over the Greek world. You begin to see the growth in the middle of all this sort of movement toward democracy. You begin to see the growth of aristocratic government. And I guess I need to explain why that happens. Remember, this is still a warrior society. This is still a militant society. And every year, Greeks fight wars, usually with each other. And the best warriors, these are basically melee-style wars that, like you see in the Iliad, where the best warriors run across the battlefield and see an equal on the other side and fight with him. The best warriors of the polis, the best warriors of the community, are the ones who get the largest share of the loot after the battle's over, which means that these families that have the best warriors become wealthier. They use that loot in many cases to acquire more land than their neighbors. Since the aristoi, the aristocratic families, had the largest land holdings, they have surplus wealth every year, and they can use that. It's usually wealth in grain. They can use that grain as loans to farmers, small farmers who are not doing as well. If the farmers who borrow from them are unable to repay their loans, then the lender might take some of the borrower's land, or he might take some of the borrower's young sons or daughters into debt slavery. That is, they become slaves to the lender until they can pay off their debt. And the aristoi become even wealthier over time. These same wealthy families become the real political power. These wealthy families are the ones who can afford to be officials. The wealthy families inevitably will sit on the council. The wealthy families will begin to see themselves as a class set apart, better than everybody else. Aristoi means the excellent ones. Sort of a Bill and Ted moment there, I guess. The aristocrats become a distinct elite class within the polis. They have more leisure time because they have slaves to do the work for them. And they can use that free time to expand their power base. They can use it to associate with their fellow aristocrats. They can use it to engage in intellectual activities, such as listening to poets and talking about what the good life should be. They can use it to discuss epics and philosophy and warfare. They can use that free time to train and improve their military skills to become essentially meaner, leaner fighting machines. The aristoi develop a class consciousness. That is, they begin to see themselves as a group set apart, superior to other citizens, not because of their wealth, but because of the special qualities their family possesses, because of their birth. These aristocratic families were wealthy, but it was the blood that counted. It was birth into an aristocratic family that counted. Their control over many Greek communities was fairly short-lived. The strong presumption of equality and changes in the economic and social structures of these Greek city-states really sort of made it impossible for the aristocracy to stay in power for a particularly long period of time. It made it almost impossible for the aristocrats to exercise complete control over these Greek states for a very long period of time. The high-handed manner in which the aristoi treated the people caused a great deal of discontent among the lower classes. Some members of the aristocratic class began to support reform. Here's the problem. The longer aristocratic rule goes, the longer and the more people who will despise the aristocrats will want to get rid of the aristocrats. Now, the aristocrats are great warriors. The aristoi can lick any 4 guys in a fair fight. But the only problem is that the more members of their community, the more their neighbors become angry with them, the longer aristocratic rule exploits the common people of the polis, the more folks there are liable to be who want to topple the aristocrats. And any good aristocrat may be able to beat 4 regular people in a fair fight, but how about 12? How about 16? How about 20? And at some point, the people of the polis, the people of these Greek states, become so angry at the aristocracy that civil war is imminent. The possibility for civil war is greater and greater, and some aristocrats begin to fear that the odds are in the common folks' favor. And so some aristocrats begin to support reform. Well, since the aristocrats have a stranglehold on the government of the polis, reform is very difficult. Traditional means of reform aren't going to work because the aristocrats have too much power, and it's not in their interest to reform the Greek states. Now, this impasse gave way to a new kind of extra-constitutional form of government, if you will, or extra-constitutional ruler. And these rulers would pop up all over the Greek world at various times when the aristocrats became too powerful. And these extra-constitutional rulers are called tyrants. Now, when we talk about a tyrant, it's always a bad thing. Oh, that guy's a tyrant. He's a terrible person. He's a totalitarian ruler. Oh, that Joe Stalin, he was a tyrant. Or, oh, that Adolf Hitler, he was a tyrant. But, and we get this sort of way of looking at tyrants from the Greek historians, because most of the Greek historians were aristocrats, and tyrants mostly took power away from the aristocrats. So the Greek historians are usually very negative toward tyrants. Tyrants came to power in various Greek city-states during the 600s BC and a little later. The tyrants were men, usually aristocrats themselves, who used political and economic discontent to seize the government by force. They would establish dictatorial power to carry out various social and economic reforms. Let me say that again. They would establish dictatorial power to carry out various economic and social reforms within the state. Usually, they did very little to change the government formally, but the coming of the tyrannies had the effect of weakening the power of the aristocrats and generally making these city-states more democratic, increasing the equality among the citizens of the state by weakening the power of the aristocrats. That's mostly what tyrants did. Now, most tyrants didn't last for very long, not more than 1 or 2 generations, because they essentially solved the problems that allowed them to get into power. And once those problems were solved, the citizens of their community, the citizens of their state, didn't want them anymore. They wanted to return to their older form of government with officials and a council and the assembly. So generally speaking, tyrannies are pretty short-lived. Now, if tyrannies last more than 1 generation, they become more brutal. They are less open to reform. The longer they remain in power, the worse they become. So, the individuals promised reform used violent means to gain their aims. They took control of the polis, but when they did so, they would reform the polis, take power away from the aristocracy, and once they had done that, ultimately that marks the growth of a democratic populace or a more democratic populace, and usually the end of the tyranny. Now, we're going to be looking at a couple of tyrannies, a couple of these tyrants, next time when we take a look at Athens in the Archaic period, early Athens down to the Classical period. And we'll see, I'll give you a little bit more concrete examples of how these tyrants work and what they do.
All right, well, that was very interesting to see how the Greek Dark Ages was a period in Greek history that will eventually set the stage for the city-states of Athens and Sparta, the polis. For our next lecture, our upcoming lecture, we will devote the entire lecture to Greek mythology. A lot of people are simply fascinated with Greek mythology and the, how the Greeks viewed religion. It's definitely different than what we've learned in the past as far as the ancient Near East is concerned. And it's different from Egyptian religion that we've also discussed as well. So when we come back for our next lecture, Ms. Victoria Moxery will discuss Greek mythology. Until next time.